What's up, everybody, and welcome back to In Search of Answers, the series where you ask me questions and I do my very best to answer them. Got some great questions lined up for today. Quick reminder, if you would like to ask a question to potentially be answered here on the show, there are two ways to do that. One is to just leave a comment right on YouTube. Just leave a comment below with your question, and it will be eligible to be included in a future episode. Also, if you are a patron, you can go over to patreon.com and either leave a comment directly on the listing for this episode over there, or there's also a form that's linked there that you can fill out to submit your question that way. Anyway, we're going to get into our first question for today. This one comes from Patreon, where Blood has asked, what is your favorite class in D&D to play and why? So I've been playing D&D for a long time, at least 20 plus years at this point that I've been playing D&D. And realistically, the answer to that question at this point is probably whatever class I haven't played most recently. I'm someone who very much prefers variety. I like to do different things. Every new campaign that comes along, I like to do something else. So every time I'm starting up a new campaign, whatever I played in the most recent campaign is probably at the bottom of the list. So like right now, I'm playing in a game it's actually live streamed every Monday. Not this Monday because our DM's been off for a couple of weeks for vacation, but most of the time on Mondays, it gets live streamed at twitch.tv/Zarina. You can also find it on YouTube. I'll put the link for I think it's Arctis DD is the YouTube channel, but I'll put the link in the description below here on YouTube so you can check it out. But I've been playing in this campaign for a while now, and I play a Goblin Artificer, and he's been a lot of fun to play. He's super goofy, very like over the top explosives and bombs, and he's an artillerist, so he has different cannons and stuff that he pulls out, and he's super fun to play. I've been having an absolute blast. But if someone were to come to me tomorrow and be like, hey, want to play in our new D&D campaign? Artificer would probably be the last thing that I would pick. And it's not because I don't like Artificer. I'm enjoying Artificer a lot. It's because I would want to do something different. I would want something new this time around. That said, I do usually gravitate towards the like spellcaster sort of classes, or at least the classes that have some element of spellcasting to them. I have played fighters in the past and had a lot of fun with them, but fighters tend to solve problems by hitting them with swords. Like I play barbarians as well. They tend to solve problems by smashing them. And I like the ability in a D&D campaign, especially a campaign that leans into the roleplay aspect of things and where it's not just combat all the time. It's also like storytelling and figuring out like political intrigue and stuff like this, and convincing people to do things for you and stuff like that. I like having different ways to approach different problems. And I like having the ability to be like, actually, hold on. If I use rope trick here to climb up and then hide myself in this building, then I can peer through that opening and I can wait an hour for the guard to come in and put the key down, and then I can drop down on top of him or whatever. Any sort of like random stuff that you can come up with to do. I also tend to prefer DMs that lean more into the like, that sounds fun, so let's figure out how to make it happen, as opposed to like going exactly by the rules as written all of the time. I think the rules are important and should be generally followed, but it's fine sometimes to like sort of fudge them a little bit just to kind of have a little bit more fun with the specific situation that's there. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I see D&D as almost collaborative storytelling. And obviously there is a person who is in charge of the overarching everything, that being the DM. There's the person who's in charge of the world. They're in charge of all the NPCs and everything else that's going on. But it's something where you're all coming together to have fun and tell funny stories or epic stories or whatever other tone it is that you're looking for. So it's always fun to have something that you can tinker around with a little bit, which is why I tend to prefer classes like Artificer or Sorcerer or Bard or Warlock or Wizard, etc. The more caster side of things, just because they have more tools and different ways to influence certain situations than they might otherwise. I have had a lot of fun playing rogues in the past. I tend to play like high charisma, very high persuasion sort of rogue in that sense, very stealthy, sleight of hand, that sort of thing. And I've played a bard multiple times in the past, and I've always had a lot of fun with bard. I think if I had to pick a single class that is the only class I would ever play again, it would probably be bard. But that's just because I find them to be very versatile, and so there's different ways that you can take a bard in different directions. Classes like Ranger can do a little bit of that as well. Paladin, Cleric, a lot of this sort of thing. And even like a lot of the modern rules for classes like Barbarian or Fighter are starting to lean more in the direction, especially things like Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and so on. These different rule sets are allowing for these classes that historically have basically just been, my job is to smash things, and then when we're not smashing things anymore, I sit around and wait for the rest of the party to do stuff. They are allowing for a lot more versatility in those classes, which has been really cool to see. Like the most recent fighter that I was playing a Goliath, who was a fighter, and he was a rune knight. And as a result, he had some like basic magic that was like based out of like giant magic, essentially, that did allow him a little bit of out of combat influence on certain situations, which was super fun. I also specifically played that character. This is the other thing, is I like to play characters that are a little bit like almost intentionally nerfed in certain ways. I do min-max a little bit here and there, but I like to always make sure that there's something that's different about each character. I want to find different ways to apply characters. So in this case, I was playing this Goliath character as being like very old. And so even though he was a fighter, I like dexterity was his dump stat. I decided dex was going to be very low for him because he's old and he's not as like fast as he used to be. He's not as quick on his feet anymore. And that, as a result, made some really interesting situations where I actually ended up with like the highest persuasion on the team, because I put all those points into charisma and wisdom instead, and that leads to a lot of interesting things. I played I love to use this example because it was so goofy, and this one came from one of those campaigns that only lasted a few sessions, which is unfortunately the case for a lot of D&D campaigns. But I played a character this was back in 3.5 edition. And we had the house rule for this campaign that a lot of DMs were using back in the day before it became an official rule, which was that paladins didn't necessarily have to have a good deity as their patron deity. You could pick anything, and you would be like technically a paladin class, but maybe more of like a zealot or some sort of like holy warrior or something like that. It wasn't necessarily specifically a good like alignment class if you used this house rule. And so I made a paladin who was a paladin of, I think the name was Istis, which is a goddess of fate in the like Greyhawk setting. I think it was the Greyhawk setting. This was a while ago. I don't really remember, but either way, it was a paladin of fate essentially. And the fun part was sitting and thinking like, what does that actually mean? Like, what does like following like a deity of greed, for example, you can at least be like, okay, my goal is to get as much stuff as I can and get as much wealth as I possibly can. That's what I do for my deity. Or a deity of mischief would be someone who's like, okay, well, I'm a paladin of causing havoc and chaos and so on. So my goal is to basically be chaotic neutral. But being a paladin of fate, I was like, okay, what this actually means is that this guy is a zealot towards the concept of inevitability. He is very convinced that his deity is telling him this is something that must occur. So therefore it's your job to go and do it. Like it is, you are making sure fate occurs for these different people. And what was fun about that was because it was always kind of towing the line a little bit of like, okay, is this guy actually like listening to some deity and following their bidding and utilizing their powers to do what they want him to be doing? Or is this just some psycho who found a sword and knows some basic divine magics? Like, is that what actually happened here? And unfortunately, that campaign didn't last very long. It was one of the many D&D campaigns I've been in over the years where we got a few sessions in and then scheduling started to become a problem and we couldn't keep up with things. But it was a really fun concept. And that's kind of the idea that I usually try to find, just weird ways to interpret things to come up with not necessarily a new concept, but a different concept than the stereotypical stuff. Which again is why, like to the point of the original question, I tend to lean towards classes that can do stuff that's a little bit more out of the box, like having a cleric primarily focused on damaging magic and not really so much of a healer, or having a bard who plays music, but it's just like banging some sticks together and it's like drum beat sort of stuff or whatever. I don't know, different ways to approach this kind of stuff. But hopefully that kind of answers that question. To me, the biggest thing is honestly, like whatever I played last time, I want to play something different next time because I want to explore different ideas and different stories and so on. I very much, when I play D&D, very much lean into the role play aspect of it a lot. So for me, I don't want to role play the same thing all day, every day, always and forever. I want to try new things and do different stuff and explore different ideas that I haven't explored before. Anyway, cool. Thank you so much, Blood, for that question. We're going to move on. Next question comes from YouTube, where Jonathan Rolf Christensen said, what are your thoughts about developers discussing potential features with the community as opposed to just announcing new features? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Factorial Friday Facts, but it's basically a weekly blog post talking about what the developers are currently working on and even just what they internally are talking about. So in general, I'm always supportive of developers being open with their communities and open with their player base about where are they at in like how are they thinking about things, what is the stuff that they're working on, what are they wanting to do with the game, assuming that it's that sort of game. Like a lot of times there are games that doesn't really make sense for, like single player story RPGs that it's like a one and done. You bought this and it's out there and now it's gone. I wouldn't expect those developers to be like, I wouldn't expect Larian Studios to be constantly telling people about what they're thinking about with Baldur's Gate 3, because as near as we can tell, they're basically done with it. It's out there. You can go and buy and play it. The game is done. This isn't a communication thing that Larian needs in this case. Now, if they were to start working on something new, if and when they start working on something new, it could be interesting for them to open that discussion up a little bit and talk about some of the ideas of things that they're working on. I'm always more interested in the idea of talking about philosophy and ideas and not necessarily tying it to here is a feature that we're thinking of developing, so much as here is a problem that we are seeing and here are some of the ways that we're thinking we might be able to approach that, and presenting it with multiple different options and multiple different ways that they might pursue a resolution to that issue. And the reason I say that is because so many times in the past, I'm going to come back to another point if I remember, but so many times in the past, we have seen cases where a developer says that they're working on a feature. The players decide that that's a bad idea and thus absolutely hate the feature. And even though when the feature actually comes out, it's fine, it's actually good, it's something that's very positive for the game in total, because it has spent so long being just actively hated on by people who just didn't have the context to know what they were even talking about at that point. This is something that people do naturally. You fill in the blanks mentally. So when you don't know the entirety of how something is going to work, you fill in the blanks. You kind of just imagine what you think that's going to be, and sometimes don't even realize that you have imagined parts of what this feature will be, and that you're not actually certain about some of these details. And so then you go, I don't like this because the picture I have in my head for what this feature is going to be is not a good one. So don't develop this. Spend time on something else, please. Don't do that. I hate that idea. And then by the time it finally comes out, the taste is so soured for you on that feature at that point that you hate it. One of the things that Jonathan mentioned in their comment, they went on to say, like giving dragon riding as an example. Should this have been something where, and to Jonathan's point and to Jonathan's credit, the actual suggestion they said was maybe not necessarily announce dragonflight early, or dragon flying, I should say, early, but instead talk about like, here's how flying is, and here's an issue that we have, and here's what we're trying to work to resolve for flying. That said, I really strongly feel like, okay, so looking at that one specifically, looking at the example of dragon flying in WoW, I really feel like, first of all, this is one that if Blizzard had said, hey, we're going to make flying more interesting and we're going to add these like active abilities and stuff so you can fly around as you're doing things in the air, and it's not just pointing yourself in a direction and then landing eventually. It's actually like flying around and it's more active. I think if they had said that and announced that way early before there was anything to look at, it would have been a disaster. It would have been an absolute unmitigated disaster. It would have been a very bad idea. It's the sort of thing that, especially for WoW, which has had so much controversy around flying over the however long at this point, all the way back to Warlords of Draenor, when it was like, there's not going to be any flying in Warlords of Draenor. And then later, like, oh, okay, actually there is going to be flying in Warlords of Draenor. There's just been so much controversy about flying. WoW players in particular are very, very skittish around anything, or at least were at the time, very skittish around anything involving changes to how flying worked. Really just universally, everyone was saying at that point in time, what we want is just to be able to fly everywhere. That is what we would want to do, is just to be able to fly everywhere. So anything that even hinted in the direction of we're making changes to flying, even if those changes to flying weren't, you can just fly everywhere all the time, people would have disliked that. And someone even said in the comments in response to this question, like, yeah, dragon flying, even when it was first announced immediately, people really hated the idea. But then once they actually had a chance to get their hands on it and see that it was fun and good, then they have the ability to go, okay, actually, this is great. This is actually something that's really good. Which leads me to another point that I wanted to make on this thing, which is that oftentimes it's important for a developer to make sure that what they're working on actually is good before they start talking about it. Dragonflying, using this as an example still, this could have easily been something where the development team, and to be clear, I don't actually know, that I'm just theorizing at this point. It was in development while I was still at Blizzard, but I wasn't part of discussions directly around it. So this is all just me theorizing. It could have easily been the sort of thing that they just started experimenting with one day. They were like, hey, maybe this could be fun. And in the case of a developer like World of Warcraft, or a game like World of Warcraft, and a developer like Blizzard, it's very, very dangerous in a lot of ways. And sometimes that danger is okay and acceptable, but it is very dangerous in a lot of ways to present, here is our list of problems that we would like to solve with flying. And at that time, you're like working on something that's trying to resolve those problems. And then if you eventually decide, okay, this didn't fix that problem, so we're just not going to do this thing, all you've now done is just basically tell people away that your game sucks. Like, you've just basically gone out and said, hey, everyone, how's it going? Flying sucks for these reasons. And then you don't do anything about it. That's one of the risks in cases like this, which leads me to the point that I mentioned before I wanted to say, which is that it's a lot easier for smaller teams to do stuff like the Factorio Friday Facts that Jonathan mentioned in their question. Factorio is developed by a team of like 30 to 35 people. It's a very, very small and tight-knit team. And in that sort of development environment, it is much easier to get a complete sense of what's going to be developed, because half the time it's one person working on that entire concept. It's one person working on that entire thing. And you can go to that person and you can say, hey, what is this thing that you're working on? I'm writing a post for our weekly blog. And they say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do this here, and I'm going to do this here, and I'm going to do this here. It's going to interact with this in this way. The UI is going to work like this. You're going to be able to click on this thing here, and it's going to do that. And then these things are going to connect together in this way, etc. And they can say all of that confidently because they're the one that's going to do all of that work. They are the person who is going to implement all of that stuff. When you're a team as large as the one working on World of Warcraft, like the UI team is a separate team of people. And even then, there's probably not one person on that team who's going to do the entirety of the UI for whatever new feature it is. There's going to be multiple people working on different aspects for it. If you're adding new spells, it's like there's the art team that's now going to get involved in this. And there's the animation team that's going to get involved in this. There's so many like different, not just different people, but different teams of people that are working on something. And making a video game is a very creative process. And as a result, people are going to be creative with how they implement different things. So it is very difficult, even for someone like Ian Hazakostas as the game director, it's very difficult for someone to say, this is what it's going to be, and know for a fact that that's exactly what it's going to turn out to be. Oftentimes, and this is not something that's unique to Blizzard, oftentimes like many different companies have said this. I heard this was often the case for people working on Star Citizen a long time ago. It would be the case where Chris Roberts, who is the head of Cloud Imperium Games, I believe he's the head of the way that they're structured is a little bit weird. So I might be slightly wrong about that, but he's basically the head of Star Citizen. And it used to be the case that people that were working on Star Citizen would watch the interviews and stuff that Chris Roberts was doing, just because that was how they found out what they should be working on and how things should be implemented. Because he would be in an interview and someone would ask him something and he didn't necessarily know that answer to that question about how such and such a thing was going to work off the top of his head, but he still wanted to answer it. So he would just say what he thought the answer was going to be. And that would then be the case of then the person who's actually working on that, or the team that's actually working on that, is like, okay, this is what Chris Roberts just said, so I guess that's what we're doing. And that would be how that would work, which is why it's often difficult for larger teams to be able to actually put out like real information on what a feature is before it's developed, because they don't, like, there isn't one single person that knows what that feature is before it's fully developed, because it's taking together the contributions from many different people. It's kind of, it sounds weird, and like it's the sort of thing that sounds way easier than it should be. Like the idea of, well, just get everyone to talk to each other and figure it out, or don't you have a design document or something like that? In reality, especially like the larger a team gets, in reality, that is a ton of work and effort to just be able to do all of that. That ultimately is not like, this is all just for a blog post when you could have been doing the work and actually developing the thing in the meantime. Like so many times, documenting everything that a feature is going to be is just as much work as just making the feature. And especially for teams that focus heavily on iteration and like we're going to implement something and try it and see if we like it. And if we don't like it, then we'll do something else. It is genuinely smarter for teams in that situation to just develop something, even if it doesn't end up being the final thing, rather than writing down what they think the something is going to be. Just develop it. And if it sucks, make something else out of it, or, figure out what they have and work with that and iterate on it, because having something they can actually interact with and play with and understand how it's working out in practice, A, takes just as much work as writing down what it was going to be in the first place. And B, gives them now a starting point to iterate on that and go further with it and come up with something else, or, scrap it and say, let's do something else entirely. But if they had to write it all down first and then document, and then actually go and implement all the stuff they just wrote down, there's essentially twice as much work to get started on it, when it would be easier and more beneficial for that team to just have a shell in place and start working off of that. Again, usually the case for much larger teams, because there isn't like a single person or a couple of people who just have the entire concept in their minds already of what work they're going to do, because it's, multiple different teams working together. Anyway, that was kind of a long-winded question. Essentially, to get back to the question itself, what are my thoughts on developers discussing potential features with the community? It's something that I will always be in favor of when it can happen. It's just important to understand that when it can happen is actually a huge caveat. It's a lot harder to make that happen than it might initially seem, especially for larger teams. Now, to the point of larger teams, I do think it's still valuable when it can happen to do that. Like, there are still cases where a team as large as Blizzard or any other team that's working, like Cloud Imperium, etc., any team that is working on these things, there are still cases that will arise where it is possible for them to go like, okay, we know we're going to do something about this, or we're going to do something along these lines. We're going to add something that does roughly this to the game. So let's talk about that. Let's at least, from a philosophical perspective, from a top-down perspective, a macro perspective, let's talk about what our goals are for this and what we're trying to achieve, and throw out some ideas of different ways we might achieve that without necessarily getting too bogged down in exactly what the minutia and the exact way that it's going to be implemented is going to be. Again, as long as it makes sense to say that before you have something complete to actually show players. Because getting back to the flying in Azeroth sort of situation, I truly believe that if Blizzard had come out and said, hey, here are our problems with flight, and we're going to work on something to solve that, the community would have just had a absolute riot about it. That would have been a catastrophe, because everyone, given WoW's history of, I'll be honest, relatively poor choices in terms of flying, given WoW's history prior to dragon flying with flying, it would not be unfair for anyone to assume that Blizzard saying, hey, we're going to change flying again, was going to result in something bad. That just wasn't a great track record at that time. So having something good to actually be like, look, we developed this. It's good. It's fun. Please go try it out on the beta or whatever. We think you will like it. That actually gives players something to go and oh, actually, this is fine. It turns out this is actually okay. So after you have that initial knee-jerk reaction of, oh, don't like the idea of things changing flying, you can then actually experience and go, wait, actually, this is good. But having that, wait, actually, this is good, ready to go at the moment you start talking about it is important in situations like that. So again, it's complicated, especially the larger a team gets, but I do always prefer when developers are as open as they can be. I just am a little bit more understanding that when they can be is actually a pretty strong, what's the word I'm looking for there? It's a big deal. Being able to actually be open and honest about stuff as a team gets larger and as you get more complicated in terms of development, it just becomes a much more difficult thing to actually achieve in a way that is beneficial. Cool. We're going to move on. Next question is from Darth Cheese Pizza on YouTube, which now I would like a cheese pizza. But anyway, what is it about MMOs that attracts or keeps older gamers, people who grew up in the MMO boom, and why is it so hard to get younger gamers into it? Seems like the majority of WoW's community has aged with the game, but I never see young people playing anymore. I wonder sometimes if the genre will eventually fade when my generation quits playing. So it was really interesting to see this, and kind of funny in a way to really see this question come up, because literally just last week, I had already recorded last week's episode, but I hadn't posted it yet. I went and had lunch with Mike Shaftnit from the Legendary days, and we were hanging out. We were talking about stuff like this, and literally one of the things we ended up talking about was how it actually kind of seems like MMOs are having a resurgence amongst younger gamers. these days. And when I say younger gamers, I'm talking about Gen Z gamers primarily. It's like the people that were born from, I think it was 1995 to 2010 is the official band for Generation Z. I'm not talking about Generation Alpha, where like the oldest they are is like 14 right now. I'm talking about the gamers who are between the ages of like 15 and I don't know what that maths out to at that point. 30, I think, is the youngest that it would be math. You guys can do the math. I can't do it in the top of my head right now. But anyway, so this is people that they are younger than I am. We'll put it that way. I am a millennial. I am at the top end of the millennials. So I am an old person at this point. And a lot of people who used to play MMOs back during the MMO boom, like Darth Cheese Pizza has mentioned here, are from that demographic. Like that was when that occurred. We were the young gamers at that point in time. We were the ones getting into this newfangled idea of MMORPGs. And so many people that came after that have been more interested in like more simplistic games. Simplistic is the wrong word to use there, but games like Fortnite, games like Minecraft, and so on. But on that point, I think what we're starting to see from the Gen Z demographic, like if you were at BlizzCon, for example, this most recent one in 2023, there were a lot of people in that like age demographic. There were a lot of younger gamers at BlizzCon specifically because of World of Warcraft. They were WoW players who were at BlizzCon and they were younger people. And that's not to say it's like a widespread thing necessarily, but at least in that sample size, one of the this is why me and Mike Schaffner were talking about this, because he brought it up. It was something that he noticed when he was at BlizzCon was, wow, there's a lot of younger people here than I would have expected. And specifically younger people who were checking out World of Warcraft. So I think there's a few things going on. One is I think that we're seeing as games, especially like WoW, tends to modernize itself a little bit. It's starting to implement more and more things that are comfortable for younger gamers, people that grew up on Minecraft and Fortnite and so on, people that have played these games for a while, but they're looking for something a little bit more involved. Especially Minecraft is probably the biggest sort of like connection I can draw, because to me, it's a pretty apparent connection. Minecraft there's a lot of depth to this game, but it's ultimately relatively simple. Like you can obviously get into like modding it and adding a ton of stuff through mods and so on, but ultimately it's about like, you load into the game, you punch trees, you build houses, you eventually work your way up to fighting a dragon, and there you go. There's other things that happen along the way, but it's like build portal, go into the netherworld, fight dragon, etc. And that's how you play Minecraft. That's kind of the ultimate goal for it at the very least. And a lot of otherwise is just sort of creative, like, yeah, get better gear, find better resources, do like advance your character, quote unquote, in a sense. So it does make sense to me that a gamer who used to play Minecraft when they were a kid and starts looking for something that they want to play that has some more depth to it than Minecraft. And maybe they've messed around with some Minecraft mods that add things like classes and XP and so on to it. Maybe they've messed around with things that add like huge towns, or they played on servers where there's huge towns that are run by people or so on. This is the sort of thing that I can easily see that sort of gamer then wanting to find something that's more of a persistent world and more of a massive multiplayer angle. And they say, oh, wait, you fight dragons in World of Warcraft? That's the entire world. There's many dragons. You can fight more than one dragon. That's crazy. I want to fight all the dragons. I can see that person, like, and obviously I don't think these people are saying this out loud like this, but I can see that person thinking in the back of their mind and finding that sort of attractive in a sense. I also think this is part of why we're seeing so many MMOs nowadays, things like PAX Day, which just hit early access, like Dune Awakening, which is coming up from Funcom soon. So many, New World more recently, that came out a few years ago. We're seeing so much more of a survival crafting aspect to modern MMOs these days and new MMOs that are coming out these days, because that is kind of the path from Minecraft as a crafting game, then go into larger persistent world sort of setting. This is something that it just makes sense. It's like, this is what you used to play when you used to play with Duplo blocks as a kid. Now you're playing with Legos, and now you're doing the weird like metal technique, whatever there are thing. I built a Lego ship the other day, so this is on my mind. But I definitely think that a lot of what we're seeing in this almost resurgence of the MMO genre is coming from that aspect of these gamers that for a decade were not really ready for like back in like 2005, 2010 timeframe. They weren't really ready for an MMORPG. It was a little bit like more advanced than what someone who's primarily playing games on an iPad is looking for. But nowadays, these people are older. These people are adults these days, and they want games like this as well. They want something that's deeper than a game that they used to play on an iPad when they were a kid. I think that's part of what we're seeing. And to be clear, I'm not trying to like belittle or when I was your age, anything that's going on right now. Like I'm repeatedly finding out that many of my friends are Gen Z. So turns out I'm just the old fart in the room most of the time. But I think that's part of why we're seeing that audience, the Gen Z audience, starting to gravitate more towards MMOs, which is giving it a bit of a resurgence, which in turn means that I think Gen Alpha will eventually get to that state as well. Like, I don't think the concept of an MMO is going away in any capacity. I think that MMORPGs are going to be made differently, and they're going to evolve and change to what modern needs for video games are. I think part of the reason why Season of Discovery has typically trended, and Classic in general has typically trended towards an older demographic, is because it's more familiar to those of us who played those games back then. And so for me, like, Season of Discovery feels natural. It feels easy. It feels comfortable, I guess is the word I'm looking for there. It's something that I can get into and I just understand all of it implicitly, because this is what games were like back when I was getting into MMORPGs. Meanwhile, games like New World, it actually took me a little bit to get to understand New World in some ways. Or PAX Day is one that I haven't played it yet myself, but I've watched a few streams and I'm like, this seems actually a little bit more like these other games, but it's an MMORPG. How does that work? Which is the other thing that I wanted to mention, is I think we're seeing more and more MMO aspects being put into things that are historically different genres. I think we're beyond the day and age where MMORPG means you have an action bar, you have a spell book, you tab target to things, and you press a button to cast a spell at something. I think we are beyond the day and age where that is what an MMORPG is. Nowadays, we have things where MMORPGs might just have completely active combat. It might be something where you don't hold right click to turn the mouse or turn the camera around. You just turn the camera. Like, that's something that was a fundamental way of how MMORPGs worked back then. And nowadays, it's the sort of thing where that probably doesn't need to be the case anymore. It's more active combat. And part of that is too, so we have better technology that's more able to, on a large scale, understand things like the direction you're facing when you're firing things. We don't need tab targeting as much anymore because we have technology that can actually check and see where you were shooting. Obviously, games like PlanetSide existed way back in the early MMO days. But even then, like, PlanetSide had a lot of issues with, like, where were you actually shooting and what were you actually hitting? And sometimes you got to shoot like where you think somebody's going to be in about 5 minutes. It was an interesting experience. Still a very fun game. I have a lot of fond memories of PlanetSide. Anyway, that's kind of a rambly answer, but realistically, my answer to the question, what is it that keeps older gamers and why aren't newer gamers playing it? I think the ones that historically we look at as MMORPGs, the WoWs, the EverQuests, the City of Heroes, and so on. These are games that, for those of us who played them back then, they're just familiar and comfortable, and that's what we like to play. But for that very same reason of familiarity and comfortability, I think that's why we're seeing this new resurgence of MMORPGs that are leaning more into the active combat. They're leaning more into the survival crafting aspect of things, because that's just what is comfortable and familiar to the modern gamer, to the younger gamer these days. I don't think that means MMOs are going away. I just think that means some of us old folks need to understand that it might look a little bit different when a new MMORPG comes out. That's basically it. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up with one last question for today. This one comes from Ender Wiggin on YouTube, who said, does your hairstylist just thin out your hair? Real question. So, slight confession that I need to make at this point. I haven't had a haircut in at least like 6 years. I actually genuinely do not remember the last time I had my hair cut, like, at all. I haven't been to a hairstylist in probably 10 years at this point. Like, I think I went to one when I first moved out to California after I took the Blizzard job, and I don't think I've gone to one since. I mostly just try as much as I can to take care of it. It does all of this curly, wavy stuff entirely on its own. It's mostly just me keeping it like hydrated and making sure that I'm using like shampoo and conditioner that aren't destroying it in some ways. That's basically it. I don't really mess with it otherwise. It just kind of does this. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for hanging out. Reminder, if you do want to ask a question, you can just leave a comment here on YouTube, or you can go over to Patreon if you're a patron. And patrons do get priority on having questions answered. So if you want to submit your question through Patreon, please do it over there if you are a patron. But that's going to be it. Thanks again, everybody. I will see you again later on.